Hello and assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to part two of my discussion with Professor Suhaib Riaz. We've had a really great discussion in part one. If you didn't check that out, please feel free to. It's on our Spotify and our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be discussing, kind of continuing our discussion from last week. We talked a little bit about the value of poetry, your interest in it, as well as extracurricular activity in general, and how it kind of informs you and helps you in your normal career, or I should say, overarching career. And I'd like to get back into that actually. So you mentioned something very interesting. You said that these kinds of things, so for you, it's playing racket sports, poetry, reading it, translating it, these things bring you sanity. And I really liked how you phrased that because I feel like I relate to that. I just didn't know how to express it. And I don't quite know how to articulate that because I wouldn't call myself insane, but there's such a truth in that, right? It kind of keeps you afloat. Would you say that's true for someone who is lucky enough to have found work in something that they're passionate about, or someone who is doing day-to-day work in what brings them passion in the thing that normal people would consider extracurricular? Does that apply to them as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it does because when you're working, you could be doing something you're very passionate about. As I am doing these days, I'm trying to work more and more on things that are of interest to me in
Right.
my research. Also doing more on South Asia because that's of interest to me. But there is always an external pressure, right? Because when you're trying to do something as part of your professional life, you're plugging into a professional system where occasionally there will be some stresses and some pressure. But it also made me think, what you just said made me think about another aspect, and this is also very much a South Asian context issue. Sometimes we think on extremes, right? So I gave an example of how, like, many of us are sort of forced into certain careers, engineering, doctor, lawyer, whatever, right? It's all pre-decided. That's one extreme. Then there is another extreme view that you may hear, although it's not generally supported. They may be like, do whatever you want, right? Follow your passion, follow your interest. I would qualify that. I would modify that a little bit, right? And this has been sort of my journey in trying to find a career. Sure, think of your interests and think of your passions.
Right.
That's internal to you, right? But you also have to think, who's going to pay me for this? Right? Unless, of course, you're coming from a feudal family where you pretty much don't really need to work, and that's basically your hobby,
Right.
right? And maybe, some of us had those kinds of backgrounds earlier, but today that's not really the approach that you want to have, right? So I try to think of it like this, right? So you want to identify what you really are passionate about, right? So as you said, so what do you enjoy? But you also want to check, am I good at this? Right? You may really be passionate about music, but are you good at it? And then the third thing is, will someone pay you to do it? Because that's a career.
Right. Exactly.
So these are the things you want to think about. Now, in my own case, I was very interested in literature, but I also knew that it's not going to be a straightforward path of sort of just, reading literature, poetry, stuff like that. And that's not going to become a straightforward career for me.
Yeah.
So when I shifted from engineering, and during engineering, I tried to strength of weak ties that we were talking about in the last episode. I tried to make friends with people who were doing English literature, for example, or who had
Mhm.
immersion in other arts and so on. That helped keep that alive. And when I shifted, I again shifted into a very professional place where somebody would pay you to do something, which is management MBA, right? And over time, some consulting work in the States and some other work, in India before that, and then into a PhD. And now here's what's happening now. Now, when I craft my research projects, I'm actually able to put these three things together. So I try to think of what is
Right.
really interesting to me. So, for example, contexts in the global South are very interesting to me, right? So, inequality, for example, is very interesting to me, and I think it's very important. We ignore this a lot in South Asia, although it is in some ways the fundamental problem, right? Economic inequality, social inequality, the way life is structured in hierarchies there, and it's something that you don't even think about. It's like a fish in water. You just assume that's how life is. It's not, right? When you come
Yeah.
here, you
Yeah.
realize no, those are all assumptions that we're just living with, right?
Yep.
So I'm very interested in that stuff. And I'm working on qualitative research now, in other ways, narratives and stories around some of that stuff. Right.
Mhm.
But I'm also getting someone to pay me for doing that,
Right.
which is the university and grants that we get for our research and so on. So these are some thoughts that I would just share based on what you said, passion and careers,
Right.
how those two interlink.
So yeah, and there's a lot there that I really found so useful. I love that you thought of it on two extremes. I was definitely on that one extreme of do whatever you want, do what you like, which of course I'm grateful for, right? I wasn't restricted, right? But it did lead to me not knowing what I want to do to a great extent, starting to figure it out now. And
I'm still trying to figure out what I should do. So
well,
don't, and I'm the previous generation, so don't feel bad about it. And as I said, this is a evolving process. You've got to construct your career path at every step.
Yeah, you mentioned that. You mentioned that in the first part. That's very encouraging for sure, at least to me, and I'm sure for everyone else. I like that it's very important for the people who I like to call happiness chasers to hear. Nowadays, I see so much in my age group as well as people just trying to chase after the perfect kind of not work-life balance, but no balance, just what they're passionate about and be able to do it immediately without any barriers, without any work, without things that they don't want to do. And you mentioned that it is just a natural part of work life, and life in general is to have, you're going to be under the external pressure and the structure around what you're doing. And I feel like people are starting to forget that. They think they can just form whatever kind of workplace they want, whatever work dynamic they want, and just do their passion thing. In fact, it took you a while to kind of bring that balance into your life.
Right. I mean,
Is that?
this is the way you explained it. I really like that.
Mhm.
There's just so many examples. You look at musicians,
Yeah.
right? And as I said, I used to be interested in Western music and bands,
Right,
and
right.
even now, the global bands and so on. A lot of these bands, once they become successful, they hate their life
Yeah.
because they have to go on these tours all the time across the
Yeah.
world and play the same old songs over and over for new audiences. And there's tons of such interviews suggesting they just hate it because
Yep.
that's the external pressure, but that's part of their contract and they have to do it.
Exactly.
Once they're back in the recording studios where they just start playing around with music again as friends, that's where they
Mhm.
start enjoying it too. So I think any work, any career will have both of these parts. You've
Yeah, for
got
sure.
to recognize that you are in a world which is not fully in your control. And as I said, that metaphor of you got to construct your path bit by bit. I just remembered an interesting thing. A friend of mine, many, many years ago, had a very interesting approach. When we were very early in life, we were looking at jobs and so on,
Mhm.
careers, we were thinking about what to do. He would pick up all the job advertisements and start looking at those. So I asked him, I said, what are you doing here? Right? He's like,
Right.
look, that's the external environment, right? What is possible out there? That's a starting point. I'm going to modify that. I'm going to construct something around that.
I see.
But maybe I need to be aware that there are these external
Yeah.
systems out there. What are people paid in these kinds of jobs? What are the skills they're looking for?
Yeah.
Right? So maybe 2 years before you graduate, you have a sense of the kinds of skills you should be working on.
Right.
Right?
I really like this. You have to understand that it's a part of work life, and it means you have to do things that you're not going to necessarily be happy doing or enjoy doing, but it's a part of work. And I like this one quote that I've kind of kept in the back of my mind is you shouldn't be chasing happiness, you should be chasing meaning in your life. And meaning is not always going to be doing whatever you want. In fact, quite the opposite is you have to do things you don't want to do, and that helps you grow, and that in fact puts you into a meaningful network and makes you a prominent actor in that system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you got to enjoy every step, right?
Mhm.
So this is the sort of binary or dichotomous thinking that I'm trying to break us out of, where we
Right.
think, oh, you choose something and now everything's perfect and
Right.
it's done. You instead, there is a path that you are constructing step by step, right? एक फैज साहब का शेर है,
Yeah.
फैज थी राह सर बसर मंजिल, हम जहां पहुंचे कामयाब आए. Right? So you got to have this approach that the journey itself is going to have those milestones which are enjoyable, which are part of success. It's not one thing, one decision, one day, and then everything else after that is over.
Right, right, yeah.
You got to build it.
Dichotomous thinking. Yeah. And how, like, how would you kind of advise people to find those things that they like? For instance, especially students who are not going to get jobs that they want right away. How would you encourage them to break out of that thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one example from my own experience. So when I was in engineering, I was doing mechanical engineering, and I hated it,
Right.
right? And I was really, really frustrated and maybe even depressed. And luckily, in Aligarh at the time, there was someone as a career counselor, and this person actually he had returned from the States. He had studied in the States.
Okay.
And I went to him and I explained, what was going on with me. He gave me two books. I still remember the name of those books, right? It's more than 25, 30 years.
Okay.
Both of those books were on management, because he said, look, if you hate engineering, there are still career paths out there. Let's try a few things. Take this stuff, read it. I came back, I read it. I was immediately excited because this was more human, right? It was closer to my interest. It was about human motivation. It was about teams. It was about challenges of, human beings and so on.
Right.
Find a mentor, in other words, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Talk to people, see what they can advise you on. Don't take all the advice as you hear it, and have some diversity in that advice, right? Try to break out of those in-group sort of networks. It's called groupthink as well.
Yeah.
That यार मेरे वालिद ये कह रहे हैं, उनके भाई भी ये कह रहे हैं, और उनका बेटा भी ये कह रहा है.
Yeah.
Like pretty much everybody in that in-group is saying, yes, you got to do this, and so you got to do this.
Right.
Step out, go talk to somebody else, somebody who's from a different environment. And as I said, this person was coming from a totally different background. So he had a very different sense of the world. So that would be, I think, the starting thought. But I will add another thing to this. Try to cultivate your own self-awareness and self-reflection. In my life, I found that becoming my own coach is probably the best thing that I can do for myself. Mentors, other coaches, they're going to be helpful, but it's all useless if you are not your own coach. And to be your own coach, you have to be a bit reflective about yourself. I'll give you an example. So anything that's happening to you, stop and ask yourself, how do I feel about this? How do I feel at this moment? Why do I feel this way? What is stopping me? Right? What can I change? These again, these are from a more management sort of background in how to build your own personality. But many of us don't do this, right?
Right.
I would say even, I developed these things very late in life. We don't take time out for introspection. Another friend of mine, at one point, he gave me this brilliant idea, and he was in a very busy career and just like incredibly busy life. He said he takes out 1 to 2 hours every week just for self-reflection. And I was really impressed, and I tried that, and I was like, yeah, because you cannot structure that time into your regular life. So much is happening. So you say, well, Sunday 4 to 5 p.m. when there's nothing else happening, I'm just going to sit down and think about what's happening to me. Keep a journal for yourself. Right. I keep a journal for myself, with multiple open pages all the time, right? Basically, it's all in the cloud. I have these notes for everything that's happening in my life, right? And this is something, as I said, I learned this approach from friends, and I sort of modified it for myself, and I find that really useful. So that's something you can do. You start writing a little bit about, what am I feeling? What's going on? What should I do next? Where will I be in 2 years, right? What do I know about this? In the act of putting it down, you will become more self-reflective, right? Yeah. And you will become, that's my takeaway that I give to most people, that become your own coach. That's what will make you your own coach. Because you're going to look at that stuff 3 months later and say, damn, this is how I was thinking. And maybe here's what I need to change. Yeah. So that's you coaching yourself, and then telling yourself, maybe I'm going to look at something different. I'm going to come back and check it 3 months later.
Yeah. It's such an inspiring thing, such a useful thing to tell people. From what you were saying, I'm just gonna, each one could be discussed on its own, but just kind of condensing it all. So much of it is inspired by kind of ancient, subcontinent, Indian, South Asian teachings, in tradition, in religion, like find a mentor and then self-reflect, meditate, kind of discipline yourself, ask yourself questions. These are all things that were at least part of our culture, and they may not be now. I don't think या आजकल तो नहीं सुनते ये वाली बातें, इनको कहते हैं बस छोड़ो, but I feel like it is part of who we are, and on some level it almost makes it easier for us to associate with and to practice. Is there ways for us as South Asians, Pakistanis, Indians, all South Asians, to introduce this to this new environment that we find ourselves in, to encourage others around us to do the same thing, because it's such a huge part of our heritage?
Yeah, I think I like it. I like the way that you connected it to more ancient cultures from the Indian subcontinent. But I would say we need it more than anyone else, because I think we have truly lost these things. My own experience is when I'm in that part of the world is that it's a much more chaotic culture. It is almost too instinctive for my taste at this point. People speak without thinking. People do things without thinking. There's very little reflection. You talk about something with one person, you expect this would be happening next year, and it's not. They're in a totally confused and chaotic life.
Yeah.
And you're like, what happened to that? And then be like, oh, I don't even remember that we had this conversation. So I think we need all this more today than anyone else. Another thing that I noticed, in my profile, you probably noticed that I started doing some yoga at some point. And now here's the interesting thing. When we were being made to do yoga in school in India, I didn't like it at all. Because to me, something that was traditional, more culturally rooted, was something that I was just not interested, right? I was maybe more interested in listening to Pink Floyd, right? Because that's just the way things happen at that age. I discovered yoga in the US, in Boston, because the way they were able to simplify it for me, and a lot of people don't like that, but I think it's still doing a service, because not everybody wants to go into the very deep aspects of it. For a lot of people, the benefits are pretty clear from just the most basic, simplified, easy to understand aspects of it. So I would say what's happened is that a lot of these things that we may have had, other parts of the world in their intellectual capacity have already discovered this, and they're probably doing it better than us. So we need it more for ourselves. That would be my view.
That's funny because it's like you would say yoga came from India, and now you would say that we needed the most. We as essentially Indians, South Asians, needed so much. And the people
we've become the kind of people who will talk about it and make grandiose claims and say we're just great people because we're coming from this culture, but we'll never actually do it.
Yeah.
And we'll never actually do it in a self-reflective manner to really understand what are our shortcomings. All of that stuff is gone.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I don't know why, and I don't know what happened there.
Right. Well, it's a question worth asking, very difficult to answer, but I feel like it also speaks so much to the sentiment that immigrants have, at least in my experience. What my relatives have had, what I've had, is rediscovering the religion that they were brought up with after they move, becoming closer with it after they are away from where they learned it from. I don't practice that much. I notice when I'm in Pakistan, I don't know, the environment is not conducive to that. But when I'm here, I am able to practice my own religion in a much better way than I am there. I forget namaz bhul jata hu, ya whatever, really.
These are interesting observations. I think these are very individual journeys, but I would agree with you that when you take a fresh look at some of this stuff, right? I mean, certainly we should respect, where we are coming from, those cultures, traditions, all that. But I think we also need to take a fresh look at that and think about it in terms of, are we really understanding this stuff? Are we actually doing some of this stuff the way it was supposed to? Are we capturing the essence? Or are we more interested in grandiose posturing that, we are the best?
Yeah.
right? And that sometimes, honestly speaking, that comes from a place of insecurity. And there's research on this, and I'm a social scientist, so I cannot avoid talking research. There is research that shows
Awesome.
that this is part of the problem, right? So globalization, for example, is making a lot of these cultures and countries more quote unquote nationalistic, because now they have encountered what's happening in other parts of the world, and there's a sense of insecurity.
I see.
Right?
And does that bleed into like immigrants who are within these countries now? Because I would say, in my experience, I've seen that nationalism embedded in that insecurity, especially for sure in my friends here who are Pakistani and even Indian. Does that also lead in to that as well, to immigrants coming here feeling that insecurity in this new place?
I think, I mean, this is not my own experience, but I think, yes,
Mhm.
there is some evidence to show that
Yeah,
this is happening.
I have
And
anecdotal evidence for it, for sure. So
right.
not the
And so
best kind, but
that, that also ties into the discussion we were having last time about getting locked into your own bubble, and just having those reinforcing views over and over, kind of like what happens on social media. And that's become a huge problem, where people are just not willing to listen to the other perspective. And that's a bit of a problem. And so I would say you want to reassess everything you've brought with you and keep things, certainly, but maybe keep them with a bit of a fresh perspective, and think about why they were useful, why they were valued, what's the objective. I don't see that happening really well in South Asia anymore.
yeah, the
I mean,
self-criticism,
yeah,
you
there's
would say.
people are very insecure. There's a very,
Yeah.
very sharp reaction to any sort of criticism, complex understanding of issues. And again, I will say this because I'm a management scholar, which is basically a social science. Understanding the complexity of issues, and this is sort of part of my research as well. That I find that this is also something we lack. We tend to oversimplify, and we are unaware of our own biases, and maybe opening out and broadening perspectives, going to different talks, listening
Yeah.
to other ways of thinking can help us reassess our own ideas that we've
Mhm.
had.
Relating to what you said last time, unlearning, and I
Yep.
feel like that's one another form of unlearning is deliberate self-criticizing unlearning.
It's very difficult to do. You're
Right.
talking of immigrants. You can look at some of us who've immigrated here. There may be some 2 or 3 generations, and they're still continuing those practices of discrimination and inequality and so on, despite being uprooted from South Asia for so long.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, this is the reality,
Absolutely. Yeah. And
because there's
I
no
just see it.
unlearning.
Exactly. Yeah. And I see it so much. I mean, the tendencies come up in myself as well as as a Pakistani male, I feel like, but also just, I do see it as well. And yeah, it can be a problem. I guess my question really there would be, so what would you say are some ways in which we can break out of that thinking? And of course, someone can go to a different talk and someone can talk to different people and they can still think the same thing and still be locked in this mindset of no, this is the way I think is totally fine because this is how I was raised. What is that link between being exposed to something different and then the change it makes in your internal mind that is, I would say, more necessary?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's a great
Yeah.
question. It's really hard to do. I think
Right.
maybe a combination of those external influences where you're really respecting what other people are saying or thinking from a different
Mhm.
perspective, that along with, as I said, some time for self-reflection. Why are we doing what we are doing, right? And this can span any level of your life, right?
Yeah.
It could be the most practical aspect of career, course. Why am I writing this essay instead of that one? It can start there, and it can go much, much deeper into the things that you talked about. Into
Mhm.
why are we following certain ways of living, certain rituals, certain things?
Mhm.
What is the essence? Let me re-understand this, and so on. So yeah, I think it's a mix. You got to build some self-reflective abilities,
Yeah.
which are
Yeah.
very hard to.
Definitely, and it
Yeah.
just requires constant practice, right? You won't get it the first time you try it, but it's a matter of doing it all the time. Like you said, do it once, 1 hour a week.
Yeah, you
Good
step
advice.
out of the bubble,
Yeah.
that you're in. So you get some insights that are different, and then you have some of your own time for reflection, right?
Hmm.
Now, having
Very true.
said that, you want to keep things that you really love from where you're coming from. I started the discussion with an anecdote on food, and
Yeah.
I want to end it on the same note. Like, we
Yeah.
live in Ottawa. I've been trying to find good nihari here for the last 4 years that I've been
Yeah.
here. I can't find it, and I'm willing to drive 4 hours to Mississauga just to go to one of those places,
Uh-huh.
get that nihari, have it, and then drive back four
And then
hours.
drive.
Right? I mean,
It's worth
those
it.
are things that I'm not
That's worth
willing
it.
to question or give up.
Yes.
Uh,
And that's such a great, yeah, different thinking about it is so many things should not be left behind. Yeah, should not
yeah,
be, ignored. Of course, there are vital parts of our identity. I talked about this on the previous, on our first episode as well, is parts of our identity. They may even be lost,
yeah,
actually. We may tend to lose our taste for Pakistani
yeah.
food, desi khana, whatever.
Yeah, and the same thing for literature and so on. And that's my journey
Yes,
into Urdu poetry more and more, right? The
I see.
further away I went, the more I started realizing its value. And I actually ended up reading people who have done translations really well, who have studied it as almost like a discipline. And through that, I got a renewed understanding of
Yeah.
what's going on and more appreciation.
Well, and that's perfect because as such a well-read person, a concluding note maybe could be, and I can share this with our listeners as well, is what do you recommend in terms of reading, for instance, in Urdu or translations in English? What are books, poets that you would recommend students read, or South Asians in general, or anyone in general read?
Yeah, it's a great question, but a tough one to answer. I think I wouldn't like to put sort of that boundary for any
Sure.
individual, because what may resonate with you at your stage and your age and your life,
Mhm.
it may be very different depending on where you are. But I would say initially, discover, go on a process of discovery and try to see what clicks. And if you like something, read more by that person and read more and more, and then you will understand a style. Like, as I gradually got into John Elia, I think over 10 years now, I'm almost at a point where I can sort of hear something or read something by him, and I would be able to try it. Like, mostly I can get something like, this has to be John Elia, right?
Right.
Nobody else could say it this way.
Yeah.
So I would, yeah, that's what I would leave you with. But there's great resources online available now, which in my time
True.
were not available.
True. Yeah.
So
So
you want to
taking advantage of those.
discover
Yeah.
that,
Hmm.
create a group, talk about this,
Hmm.
have fun with it, and that's what
Mhm.
those things are gonna save you when everything else in your life is going wrong.
Right, yeah. And I feel like I'm only beginning to start realizing that, of course, as I move forward. And I'm sure so many of our listeners will be able to identify with that. So I think that was a great concluding note. We could keep talking about so much, but for this installment at least, thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. We really appreciated you coming, sharing your perspectives. I think I took a lot from this discussion, and I really hope our listeners did as well. If you haven't listened to part one, everyone, please do. Thank you so much, Professor, again
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thank you, Mikhail, and thank you to all your team and that wider group of people who are the audience for making this possible. I really enjoyed it. What a great initiative, and I wish you all the best with it.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, and hope to see you and talk to you soon.